Welcome, William Barylo. William Barylo is a PhD, sociologist, and a visual artist exploring race, class, gender, and belief through a decolonial lens. He investigates how grassroots organizations resist and flourish despite systematic exclusion. His work includes directing the documentary Polish Muslims and an Unexpected Meeting and researching how Muslim millennials shape a fairer society. And he also has his own YouTube channel, which I'd recommend anyone listening to check out. It's very useful, and I find it quite thoughtful as well and thought-provoking. Anyway, thank you, William, for coming on. I'm really happy to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
As a sociologist, one of the key questions I find myself, I'm not a sociologist, but you're a sociologist. One of the key questions I find asking myself is, what, despite Muslims claiming we have the best religion, it's the truth from God, we're at the bottom of every social metric that you want to be at the top of. When it comes to education, crime, material prosperity, poverty, things like that. Why do you think that is in the UK?
Don't you think it's a bit generalizing to say that Muslims as a whole end up at the bottom of the social metric indicators?
To some extent, it's generalizing, but the figures are reflective of the situation, aren't they?
Because I think, it's rather than sorting people by religion, I think it's also very dependent on people's cultural background, meaning that I know that from what people say, it's usually something which is attributed to people from Mirpuri background or Sylheti background, as opposed to, for example, Pakistanis from Karachi or Bangladeshis from Dhaka. And again, if we look at Somalis, I think the figures are a bit different in the sense that these are people who usually outperform others. So I think it's very dependent on people's background. So I don't know if you have come across these more detailed figures or anecdotal mentions during conversations, but so I think there's to say that it's about Muslims as a whole. I think it's a bit of a generalization. However, if you ask me about these particular demographics, which are at the bottom of some of the indicators, I think it's a very complex situation because we need to take into account that it's people who generally come from already lower social and economic classes, whether it is in Pakistan or Bangladesh. And it's people who haven't had the opportunity to properly flourish in a country like the UK, where when people settled, the infrastructures were not there, and people didn't know about the system, the British society, which means that people didn't have the correct tools to be able to progress, plus not mentioning the racism and discrimination against people. So it's I think it's when it comes to poverty, when it comes to lack of education, I think it's some of very complex factors that do not have a single root cause. But there might be some more, I would say, individual / family specifics, but when we talk about people in general, I think we much need to consider the system they are ended up in, and is the system provides the correct tools for them to flourish in a way. Does make sense.
So you think it's largely demographic related, these things? And so, for instance, most of Muslims in the UK are, let's say, Pakistani and from Kashmiri background. I think a significant majority are, and that's a very impoverished background. It's not a civilized culture like coming from a major city or cosmopolitan area. So there are certain attitudes that they brought along, and it takes a lot of time to really shed that heritage and adapt to a different culture.
Yeah, if you take, for example, it's a general issue about class in general. If you take people who come from rural areas and still in the cities, these are people who do not have the social, the intellectual capital to navigate urban environments and the education system of a different country. Because if you look at, for example, the trajectory of people, for example, Bangladeshis from Dhaka or Pakistanis from Karachi, it's a very different dynamic. Again, I'm not generalizing, saying like all Bangladeshis from Dhaka or Pakistanis from Karachi are successful according to these metrics, but they generally have parents or people in their families who know how to navigate certain systems. For example, what is it possible to do within the education system? Or is it possible to reach within the society through people's career and so on? Which means that when it comes to people who are generally at the bottom of these socio-economic indicators, it's people who do not even know what it is possible to do with all the opportunities that are given to them in a country. And it's the same for white working class people. You know, my parents are Polish working class. They immigrated to France. And I'm the first one in the family who got through higher education and got a PhD. But that's otherwise, you know, I would have become the classic, you know, GP, engineer, or banker. This is what my mom wanted me to become, but because they didn't have any other idea what it is possible to do within the education system and within a society.
I see. But the thing is, you could say there's a difference with culture, and there's also the religious idea as well. So surely, like, does not Islam not promote things like doing well in life, you know, striving for excellence and things like that? So is religion not a factor here, and in encouraging people to strive to be better and you know, to achieve high things, to achieve excellence?
I think in an ideal scenario, in an ideal society, definitely, I think if people were following Islam to the T, I think there would be probably pushed to explore all these different opportunities, these different options, and perhaps take different career trajectories. But again, when it comes to the demographics we're talking about, I think it is important to remember that not all Muslims follow Islam or even know exactly about the religion, the text. Because for many, just like for many Christians in Europe, religion is more of a cultural heritage. It's not something that people consider as a framework, a guidance for life. It is something which is mainly made of rituals. It is mainly made of also rituals with a certain cultural flavor. But I've rarely come across people who actually use a religion or faith as a framework for setting their direction in life. So this is, I think, the first consideration that lots of people do not have access to, I mean, they have access to religious knowledge, but again, what kind of religious knowledge? I think this is one question needs to be asked, because lots of people, you know, are proud of being Hafiz Quran. People know the Quran by heart in Arabic, but does it mean that they understand the Quran in their mother tongue? And this is a different question, because fair enough, they by heart, but do they then know the meaning of the different verses, and what do they entail, the interpretations, the context of the revelation, and all the elements gravitating around the verses themselves that make the religion a guidance for life?
I see. And how do you think, what's the difference here? How do you think people can make Islam a framework for living rather than just being carried with the wind of culture?
You know, I think when it comes to faith and the relation people have in regards to faith, I think it's a very intimate matter, meaning that I don't think, I mean, there's, you know, a verse in the Quran that, you know, if you want people to change, first you should change themselves. And God will not make people change unless they change themselves, which means that the equivalent in English would be almost that, you know, you can bring a horse to the water, but you cannot make the horse drink, saying that it's very much upon people to re-examine their relationship to the religion, to God, to the faith, and to the texts and what they do with them. It's you know, there can be as many YouTube channels, podcasts, or religious lectures in their local area. It doesn't mean that people will automatically absorb the message and decide to practice themselves. It's a, you know, it just, if I reflect on my own personal faith journey, this is very much like personal circumstances that led me to turn to God. To understand my role in society, on the planet, and take a certain direction in life, which I found was in accordance with what I believe was right. But again, you know, it's when I've studied, I've done research with grassroots organizations, for example, organizations that, you know, serve soup kitchen to the homeless, people who literally dedicated their lives for the poor on a voluntary basis, completely unpaid, in France and also in the UK. I've realized that the most committed people I've met in these charities, people who, you know, even if there's 3 people to do a soup kitchen, they will just, you know, go cook the meals, take the van and do it. The most committed people I found are usually those who have the most moving life experiences, in the sense that these are people who have encountered some hardships in life to the point that they have, these hardships have made them reflect on themselves, you know, question, you know, why am I here? Is the direction I'm taking in life all right? You know, it's people who are pushed into a space of self-introspection, in which afterwards decide, yeah, I'm going to commit to this cause, I'm going to dedicate my time. But, you know, sadly, it's, you know, unless people don't experience anything really challenging that pushes them to reflect, I think, you know, it's humans by nature like comfort. And when there's comfort, there's no logical reason, you know, to introspect yourself and question, you know, what is my role on earth really? So yeah, I think this is the crux of the matter.
I see. And do you think there's something about modern life which is so comfortable that there's a lack of inertia to change and reflect? Perhaps in the past that it would be more likely people would reflect more often, but we have so much entertainment, as Julius Caesar said, give the masses bread and circuses and they won't revolt. We have so much to entertain us nowadays, we don't really take time to think about how we're living our lives, and therefore we won't really be encouraged to change.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is, yeah, part of it is the entertainment that has become our lives for many. But again, I think, you know, if we reflect at what was the situation back in time, I also think that people were, especially at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder, were not in a position to just, you know, pause and reflect about the meaning of life, especially I'm thinking from the start of the industrial era, where people were pushed into work, and the 9-to-5 routine, let's say, came into play, and people just were deprived of this time for reflection about life. Because if you look at rural areas, it's a bit different, where people were able to manage their own time and work the land, and yeah, then you had space and time to contemplate, to reflect, to just, you know, you observe nature, and it makes you think about things. But so I think it is definitely a modern phenomenon that people were forced and pushed into factories or into these work routines, were deprived of the material time and space to just, you know, stop and reflect. It's become like, you know, the continuous grind, and people have been just unable to do that. And, you know, I think the entertainment factor came on the top of it more recently, first with the arrival of the TV, then, you know, later the internet, now social media, and definitely that hasn't done any good. It hasn't improved the situation, in the sense that, you know, people are already wounded by this work routine, not having time for themselves, their friends, or their family. And the easiest outlet people find to, I would say, find some, like, try to soothe their condition is going to be through entertainment, through social media, because it's just, you know, in the palm of your hand. And again, so people become trapped in a vicious circle, and it's very, very hard to escape from it.
Yeah. Just want to bring it a little bit back to the previous topic about the sociology of Muslims, because this is one thing, because you mentioned Muslims in the UK. Like, what I'm from Pakistan, so when I visit back home as well and I observe the world around me, so I've been to different cities, and the amount of mess that's there, is incredible. It puts, like, I've never seen anything like it. The amount of waste there is, and typically I would think that these people they have a closer connection to the land, right? Because they tend to grow more of their own food. Even if they're in cities, they have relatives who are in villages, and they're all into farming and things like that. But even being on a farm, there's still so much plastic waste littered on the side. What do you think of this? Like, how does that come about? Because typically, when you're living in the land, you don't trash it because that's where your food is coming from. But there seems to be like a proliferation of just mess and trash, even in the lands where you live and where you farm. What do you think
Yeah.
that causes that?
So I think, so for the context, I've been done research with a population in French Guiana in South America called the Bushinengue, and they have faced a very similar problem in the sense that even if you went there in the early 2000s, so these are people who are descendants of Africans brought to French Guiana, and they fought against slavery and settled along the main rivers of French Guiana and Suriname, and also British Guiana to some extent, the Bushinengue. So they have, the way they lived life traditionally in these villages was in harmony with nature. People would make sure that the holes in the nets were not too small, so they could catch only the adult fishes and let the younger fishes go through. They would recite a prayer before cutting, build a house or build boats, because they consider nature as, humans and nature are just one same entity. So if you cut something, you need to ask permission, you need to and again, if you look at the society, how it works, what was valued in the society, like a man of value among the Bushinengue in the early 2000s was someone who was able to cut the wood to build a house or a boat, to hunt, to navigate the river, had a practical knowledge and very much the knowledge of the natural environment. And if you fast forward 8 years later, in 2008, when I did my first field work in French Guiana, these values were completely turned upside down. The knowledge of the natural environment is in decline. People are drawn to the big cities, and now people are obsessed with buying the largest house, the largest TV, the biggest car. And this has happened in let's say 1 or 2 decades at most. And when I was speaking to grassroots organizations there in French Guiana, why did that happen? The main theory is that people have not been what's the name in English? Accompanied. I don't know if it's in English, but they of this of consumerism was so sudden that people didn't have the time to realize the harm plastic bags, packaging would produce to the environment. So now in people's mind, you just unpack your TV and you either throw plastic and the packaging to the river, thinking that it's going to be carried away to the sea anyways, or just dig a pit in the ground and you just burn it without realizing it's going to release some toxic gases. But that's because people don't know. They don't know the consequences. They haven't been informed about them. Consumerism, the big supermarkets, it settled in French Guiana, offered all these things to people, and without any information. So I think it's because it's a very sudden phenomenon, and because people cared more about profit first. They didn't take the time to just inform people, and so now all these grassroots organizations are catching up, and even though people are dealing with serious health problems, it just now it's a game of catching up, sadly.
Yeah. Do you think sorry, I forgot my question now. I was going to say, do you think like, I think Marx, he talks about commodification, the idea that in capitalism, people become increasingly estranged from the conditions of production, and therefore they're more likely to expropriate nature. I think this is what you're hinting at, because they've lost that, you can say, primordial knowledge about the world and how things work, and that has affected the relationship with the land. And yeah, you certainly see that, especially like in let's say Asian areas in the UK, like they're always the messiest for some reason. But you could say to the same extent that the non-Muslims, or let's say middle class or working class white people, they don't have that agricultural knowledge, but their areas are not as messy as, let's say, the Pakistani areas in the UK. That's certainly a phenomenon I've observed.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, we can really generalize because being messy. I think whether you look at the UK or France, whatever is people's culture, ethnicity. I think it has become a stereotypical marker of poverty in people struggling. And again, what you mentioned, I think it makes sense, because on my end, when I was trying to understand the phenomenon of carelessness, let's say, with the environment, I think it's a very modern phenomenon, in the sense, not modern in terms of time frame, but modern in essence, meaning that the French sociologist Touraine mentioned that when defining modernity, it is mainly a culture of division, which means that it's a culture of separation. It's a culture of being building distance between things, between people. So we are building distance between us and the planet. We're building distance between each other, between our neighbors. This is, it explains so many things, from why don't we speak to our neighbors anymore, to why do people hate on each other because of their cultural differences, to how do we build a distance with the planet we cannot relate to anymore? And we think, it's just maybe a nice background, a decor, that we can do anything with it, without realizing that only a few decades ago we were extremely dependent on it. And if people had a consciousness that if you don't respect the environment, it's going to have consequences, whether villages would be flooded, whether crops are not going to grow. People could realize live and with their own eyes and their own hands, if they did not respect the environment, there would be immediate consequences. But now we have been so that we have become disconnected from all these things, whether we talk about the environmental dimension, the human dimension, and so on.
Do you think it's possible to have like population of 8-9 billion people on Earth, majority of whom want to have like modern Western lifestyles? Do you think it's possible to have that and have like a sustainable economy, where nature is not like trashed and destroyed?
I think it's a challenge, because although I'm not specialized in these topics. My focus is very much microscopic, because I know that according to the general trend of studies around the environment, the Earth should be enough for that many people. However, what the Earth is not enough for is the lifestyle people aspire to, especially in urban environments. For the reason we just talked about, in the sense that there is now a global culture of growth, which means that it's a very much a culture of numbers. You need to be successful. To be successful, the definition of success is a metric, and what defines success is the amount you earn, is the size of your house, it's the price of your car, and so on and so on. I think the global neoliberal society has become very detached from success in terms of values, or in terms of non-numerable indicators. And for that reason, people are seeking this hypothetical growth at any cost. And it's only, if you look at the time scale of the history of humanity, it's only very, very recently that we have realized that, hold on a second, if we keep if we hold on to these metrics and so on, there's going to be consequences which have now become very clearly measurable. So I think it will require a drastic lifestyle change for many, many people. But again, it's a complex factor, because even if have a different lifestyle, does the society allow them to adopt a different lifestyle? Because there's so many things contingent to the amount you earn, because it directly relates to can you find a decent shelter, can you afford food, and if we were to revert to hypothetically decentralized form of economy where people would live out of cooperatives, farms, and so on, I think it can be possible, but definitely is going to take a very, very long time, and it's going to be potentially technically difficult for people who are in very dense urban environments. But again, there's always going to be a part of the population that is not going to agree with that, and think that still the goal in life is going to be to pursue material possessions, wealth, and so on, and we'll have to somehow deal with them and find a compromise.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is that the value of human relationships has definitely diminished over time in the modern world, and it's been replaced by some kind of commodified entity or relationship, or increased drive to make money. Perhaps that's neoliberalism for you, but yeah, I think that's especially true, because I think as you go through life, you notice the quality of your life is all about your relationships. It's not really that much about how much money you have in your bank account. It's about your relationship to other people and how you're feeling at any given moment in time. Do you think there's something about this whole neoliberal idea of increasing commodification, increasing hardship and circumstances with people are living with, and it makes it difficult for them to connect to God or connect and have better relationships? Like, is there a case that because there's more financial pressure, they're forced to think of success in terms of material outcomes?
Yeah, I see two things here. The first thing is there's definitely for the lower people who are on the lower end of the social economic ladder, there is a problematic of survival. Because I remember when I first came to the UK, so I didn't know anyone in this country, and when I lost my job, it's you can lose like everything from the moment you lose your job. So because I didn't have any safety nets in the UK, when I lost my job, I became literally homeless because I just couldn't afford to pay the rent anywhere. £500 a month for a small room even if it was like me in a house shared with 18 people, that's quite a sum of money. And this is not something you can just have it in. And if more than half of your wages go into the rent, so you have to think carefully about what kind of food you're going to eat, and so on and so on. So people are already held in a very precarious situation, and that's I think the first factor. And then I think the other thing is, let me catch my thoughts because I've lost the train, my train of thoughts. You were mentioning, what did you just mention in your question?
I mentioned the idea of increasing poverty, increasing or less and less value of human relationships, and the cost of living, the cost of just living life well, flourishing, becoming increasingly high, which forces people to value material outcomes more and more.
Yes. So yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention is on the other end. So you have the survival problematic on the one hand, and on the other, something which I think is very, very specific to the British, American, in the US and Canada society, is that there is a theology of liberation, which is neoliberalism has become a theology of liberation, which means that people are sold literally the idea that if they want to escape their condition, they can just buy their ticket out of it. Whether, you can buy your way out of racism, out of poverty, if you become either famous, wealthy, or powerful. So it pits people into a race for these things, a race for money, a race for power, a race for influence, because they believe that, yeah, if they're rich enough, they can, they can be immune to racism, and there's a huge also. And this is compounded by, I would say, an economic trauma response that many people from poor or immigrant backgrounds have, just like my parents, for them, the priority for me was to earn as much money as possible because they wanted me to be safe. They didn't want me to experience the same thing they've experienced when they came to France. This is why they pushed me to become a GP, to become a banker, because these are professions where, you earn a lot of money. For them, money was safety and safety was happiness. So by shortcut, money was happiness. And so many people are not only forced, but also sold this idea that, money solves everything, because this is, this is also propagated with popular culture. What we see around is, this quote of, you have to earn six figures, you have to be retired by age 35, and these kind of narratives. So it is very much, a definition of freedom, contentment, and happiness in monetary terms and numerable outcomes. And yeah, I think it's people are attacked from all directions with these narratives, and so I completely understand that people, they become completely disconnected from higher purposes in life.
I want to change topic now slightly. There's a video that you uploaded, which I found really, really interesting, is why I left British Islam, I think. And I found that really, really fascinating. I share, I think, many similar sentiments, but I want to ask, because you've like identified this thing called British Islam and put it to one side and say, look, I'm not really part of this ethno-cult culture or whatever. This is like, I want to focus on like God more. What are the like key differences, and how do you separate belief in God and Islam from what British Islam is? Like, what are the key demarcations there?
Well, I think we have to be very careful with our words here, because the title of my video, first of all, was a question: leaving Islam or leaving Muslims?
Also,
because the thing is, of course, I think it's very important, first of all, to make a difference between a faith, a religion, and the people who practice it, who do not represent the religion. And second, I think the way Islam has been practiced in the UK, again, it's a generalization. There's always exceptions, but at large, I think it is something which is sadly very remote from the Islam that I have been taught. I've learned through reading the books, the primary sources, and it has for many become more of a like ethno-linguistic identity, in the sense that unlike what I've seen in France, here, if you're not either South Asian or Middle Eastern, it's very, very hard for people to accept you as a valid Muslim. And again, I've seen, like, I've found pockets of people where, we were on the same page and they accepted me as I am. But I think at large, because again, Islam is not for many people. It's not a framework or a guidance for life, but more of a cultural heritage. They associate, maybe subconsciously, the fact of like being Muslim with being of a certain ethnicity, from a certain background. So again, I don't want to blame people for that. There's like structural reasons for that. And although I believe that if people were a bit more conscious about their faith, things would be solved. But it comes from a personal experience, meaning that when I was looking for jobs, or I was looking for marriage here in the UK, the first time in my life, something I've never experienced in France, is I was rejected because for reasons like my parents are Polish, or because yeah, I just don't tick the right boxes. And it's the first time I realized that actually, yeah, being Polish was a problem in this country for some reason. And later on, I understood with Brexit that, it's perhaps a mainstream narrative that has transpired into many sub-communities in the UK, and the stereotypes of the Eastern European migrants coming here, taking people's jobs and trying to impose their barbaric lifestyle, people have bought into it. So, yeah, I think so. It has come. This video has come from a place of pain because it just, as much as you would find the narrative in every ISOC, in every big humanitarian charity, or in almost every mosque, the narrative that the Ummah is like one body, and it's a community of solidarity. If you're Muslim, you'll never be alone because we're all brothers and sisters. So people have repeated, this narrative of this ideal community, this ummah, where people are. This is this. Sorry, I'm gonna just rephrase it a little bit. So when I came to the UK, in every ISOC, in every student society, in every multi-million pound humanitarian charity, in every mosque, you would have on repeat this discourse as the ummah, this community being one body, and that if you're Muslim, you'll never be left alone because we're all brothers and sisters. So if something happens to you, it's like you have my back, I have yours. And sadly, I found a huge dissonance, a huge contrast between this narrative that was in every self-identified Muslim space and the realities of life, where if you don't tick the right boxes, you're too different for others. And this is not only with me; it's lots of my friends who are new Muslims who reverts to Islam, as people say, but who are Black, South Asian even, and stories of them being left alone doing iftars at the mosque because nobody wants to be with them. Not understanding, oh, you're Black, how can you're from the West Indies, like, how can you be Muslim? It's sad to see this. Even among people of my generation who were born in the 80s or who grew up in the 90s. And yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done on that field. And but sadly, I think, the journey of being a new Muslim is much about building your own community from scratch rather than finding it, because I think in a country like in the UK, where people are already very individualistic because of the neoliberal culture for results and growth and material success, and people have very little knowledge of Islam as a conceptual framework and a guidance of life and more of a cultural heritage. I think these are compounding factors that make it very, very difficult. And, you realize that, well, yeah, whatever people say, you're alone. And so if you need to create your own community from scratch, this is not something you can find.
Yeah, I recognize a lot of the things you experience, especially you could say the false jingoism, because you have this, like, let's take example for example, the Uyghur protests you have, right? The Uyghur Muslims in China who are experiencing hardship under the Chinese government. If, let's say, some groups of Muslims who are protesting on their behalf understood what they believed in, they would declare them heretics. Like, if they live next door to them, they would think they're heretics, but because they're oppressed, they have to fight their cause. But it's a weird irony about these things. But as a sociologist, right, how do you differentiate between, like, there's the idea of like Islam is what Muslims do, and how do you identify, like, differentiate that and identify this is what Islam is, this is what God wants me to do? Because could it not be argued that Islam is what Muslims do overall?
Yeah, so I mean, there's many definitions when it comes to sociology. What do we consider as Islam? And I always make a clear difference between Islam as a frame of reference, something I call an ecosystem or a complex system, or okay, I've used the term matrix in the past, but it's nothing to do with modern reference. I'm talking about the uterine matrix. The womb, an environment which produces things and gives birth to thoughts and action. So this is how I define Islam when we talk about the faith or the religion. And again, when we talk about faith or religion, these are terms which are very damaged by their modern usage and definition, by their cultural, imperial, colonial legacies. So it's very hard for me to just, I cannot talk about Islam as just as a religion. As I say, it's a complex system. It's more of a framework, a guidance for life, a philosophy, it's all of these things together. And then there is Islam as what sociologists would call a lived religion, which means exploring Islam from the practices of people. And again, I think it's important to highlight this. This is perhaps an interpretation of Islam among many others. It is something which is very specific to people understanding. And, to quote Gandhi on this, even though, I don't hold him as a role model or anything. He once said that there's as many religions as there are people. So when it comes to how Islam is practiced in the UK, there's like millions and millions of different ways Islam is practiced, depending on which family, with people, and so on. And I think this is a very important distinction to make, because again, people do not represent God, they do not represent the religion. It's just their own practice according to their own interpretation and their own understanding.
Okay, I think that's an interesting take. I mean, I'm sure this, like, we can extend this discussion far more, but I'll leave that question of sociology there because it's a big academic debate. I think final question now. One of your LinkedIn posts, right? You said you've read a lot of books on AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning. What interested you in that field? Just out of curiosity, coming from sociology into maybe the very technical software.
So it comes from interviews and observations on the field, and I would say Muslims' relation with what we already have as a form of AI, which I mean by that, I mean machine learning algorithms that populate our social media, our feeds, whether it's, mainly back in the days it was Facebook, then Instagram, now it's TikTok. And especially when it comes to Muslims who are, because of their economic situations, are more or less pushed into taking up social media as a full-time job, and where they become, influencers or content creators, again, because of this very neoliberal theology of liberation offered by social media, that whoever you are, whatever is your culture, whatever is your background, you can become anyone you like, and you can become famous from one day to another. You can earn millions, because again, there's a few exceptions to the general rule. A few people become famous and earning an income on social media. So people believe it's possible and people buy into it. But the problem is, when it comes to social media, this is your income is much more is related to how much attention can you gather. And how do you gather attention? It's through being controversial, to being shocking, to it's which means that it has become to a point where, when it comes to people making an income on social media and who identify as Muslims, when you look at the content they produce, the narratives, it's very, very remote from even the kind of Islam their own parents were practicing. It's something which is very remote from any morals and values. It's a very commodified and utilitarian relationship to faith. Now, Allah has become a brand, literally. This is what we see on social media. And, not only that, but it's also something people do at the cost of their morals, their ethics, their culture, their identity. You have literally to make yourself into a product. You have to make yourself into an object to be successful on social media. There is no privacy anymore, and everything you have in your life becomes a means to make money. You are gonna show how you live, one day in the life of XYZ. You're going to show your kids on social media, show off your husband, your wedding, expose everything about your life. Everything is an argument for making money. And my research was investigating how Muslims in the UK and in North America have become colonized by this new form of culture that makes everything into a product. And what are they losing in the process? So we were talking about their ethics, their morals, their identity, because people are being pushed, they're not forced at all. There's no laws or anything like it was back in the days in colonialism, but they're strongly suggested that this is how you should become, this is how you should speak, this is how you should look to be somehow accepted by the society, to earn an income, to be successful on social media. And what people do not realize is, they're just going to play the game without realizing what they lose in the process. And now we have, with the development of an AI which becomes stronger and stronger, it's just not, we're not only suggested things through, the recommended section on YouTube, or what our feed is showing us, or thinking, what is the content we would like to engage with. But when it becomes used in institutions like, for job search, for example, with healthcare, with insurance, these also have very much consequences with people who do not come from, let's say, not only the majority background, but people who who abide by the dominant norms, whether, it's a social, economic, cultural identity norms, and so on. So my fear is that AI, as appropriated by institutions and companies, are going to be very exclusionary tools, where if you don't tick the right boxes, you're not going to be able to go anywhere. You're not going to be able to have a career. You're not going to be able to find a spouse. You're not going to be able to get reasonable insurance premiums, and so on, be able to secure a mortgage or anything. Just live and survive. So the first perspective was, I was curious about how these machine learning algorithms would subvert people's cultures and morals and values very, very subtly. And I'm wondering, how is it possible to create something which is more balanced? And this is a very complex question, because the more I've been reading about AI, and the more I realize it's not only a developer's problem. It's not only about code lines. It's not about how people at the back end think about the programs. Of course, it's important to have teams which are as diverse as possible. People who are also, there's a lot to do with the user experience research, meaning that there's a lot of beta testing to be done with every stakeholder possible. It's just not the target demographics which companies are targeting as end users. It has to be a consultation with all kind of stakeholders to first of all develop a program which could be as like social proof, like future proof as possible. But there's also a huge part of responsibility on the end user side of things. How are people understanding all these new programs that we are given, all these apps, this software? Because you can make the most ethical AI program you want, but if at the end you're going to have people worshipping this software as God, that's not the company's responsibility. If we I see how people rely so much on social media to try to survive in the society, and it's almost deifying social media, considering us a god, because even you analyze the way people talk, or he's been blessed by the algorithm when someone becomes viral, or we talk about the algorithm as some kind of entity that is able to judge people, that is able to, we don't understand how it works, but still, how can we please the algorithm? So, it's like people are talking about some kind of God when they talk about the machine learning algorithms already, because, people rely on them to find partners, spouses, find jobs, find, content, and everything, more and more in our lives rely on them. But so it's also about, the question would be, how can we create a society that is critical enough about these programs to use them in a reasonable and healthy manner? So yeah, it's a huge problem, and I'm really curious about exploring these problematics, whether it's from like an academic perspective, from with the end users, or on the back end. Yeah, this is a whole universe to be explored, I think.
Okay, that's very, very interesting, because I think so. You're concerned with the ethics fundamentally, right? That's the main driver, I think, of how it shapes our narratives and things like that, and where we get income from. For me, it was very different how I got into AI, because for me, it's like it's a fundamental new technology, and technology changes civilizations. And I think AI is one of the ones which breaks capitalism, because is AI labor? Is it capital? We don't know, right? And it's not really, it's hard to define as either. So that, for me, that breaks capitalism, which breaks our economy. So we'll see how things go from there. Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. Again, thank you for coming, William. Really enjoyed listening to you talk and learning from you.
Thank you very much, Hamza. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure.